Good evening, everyone. Tonight we're settling into something a little darker than usual, but don't worry, we'll keep the pace slow, the tone gentle, and the lights low, the way you like it. Tonight's story is about the men and women history remembers only as shadows, the killers for hire of the medieval world, the assassins. Before we drift into it, if you're the kind of person who likes to support quiet corners of the internet making strange, sleepy history content, feel free to leave a like. And if you want, tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight and what time it is where you are. It's always nice to imagine a little map of the world, dotted with people slowly drifting off to sleep together. Now get comfortable. Maybe pull the blanket up a little higher. Dim whatever's left of the lights. And let's ease slowly into the unglamorous, unglorious, deeply exhausting world of the medieval assassin. Here's the first thing you should understand, and it's going to undercut every dramatic image you might be picturing right now. Nobody in the Middle Ages grew up dreaming of becoming an assassin. There was no child sitting by a fire, gazing at the stars, whispering, "One day, I will slit a duke's throat in his own bedchamber for a handful of coins, and then live the rest of my life in terror." That fantasy simply didn't exist yet. It's a modern invention, built out of novels and films and video games with hooded figures leaping across rooftops. The real version of this life was not a fantasy. It was closer to a last resort, the kind of path you ended up on only after every other path had closed behind you. Think about who actually became an assassin in medieval Europe, or the Middle East, or medieval Asia for that matter. It wasn't the second son of a wealthy merchant looking for excitement. It wasn't a bored young noble seeking adventure. It was almost always someone who had already fallen through the cracks of society. A soldier discharged from a war with no land, no pension, and a body full of old injuries. A thief who'd gotten too well known in one town and needed new, quieter work. A servant dismissed without a reference, with no family to fall back on. Someone whose name had already been erased from polite memory. If you had money, status, a house, even just a bit of land or a trade, you didn't become an assassin. You hired one. That's the harsh little truth sitting underneath all of this. Killing in the medieval world was a service industry, and like most service industries, the people doing the dangerous, dirty, exhausting labor were rarely the people profiting most from it. If you owned land, you were the client. If you'd lost everything, you were the help. So picture your actual candidate. Someone with no living relatives who'd notice if they disappeared. Someone with a talent for moving quietly, a decent memory for patrol schedules, and absolutely nothing left to lose. That person didn't apply for the job. The job found them. A stranger in a tavern corner, a folded note passed under a door, a quiet word from someone who already knew someone. And the name they were given to think about wasn't a random peasant who owed a gambling debt. It was someone protected. A bishop who'd made too many enemies. A baron sitting on land 3 other families wanted. Someone surrounded by guards, walls, and a small army of servants whose only job was to notice strangers. The pay might sound tempting on paper, but by the time anyone seriously considered this work, tempting wasn't really the operative word anymore. It was closer to necessary. No family left to feed. No future worth planning for. Certainly no guild, no union, no colleagues to complain to over a drink. And even if there had been, complaining about your job in this line of work was itself a good way to end up at the bottom of a river. And that's really the heart of it. There was no career ladder here, no apprenticeships with a signed contract and a probation period, no retirement party. You couldn't casually mention your profession at the local inn. "Oh, me. I do quiet errands for important people, mostly at night, mostly involving knives," without someone quietly excusing themselves to go find the local watch. Discretion wasn't a professional courtesy. It was the only thing standing between you and a very short, very public death. So when we say medieval assassin, we should immediately let go of the image of a trained specialist with a code of honor and a secret order behind them. Mostly, we're talking about desperate, ordinary people, pushed into extraordinary and horrifying work by circumstances that had already stripped away every softer option. They weren't villains twirling mustaches in the shadows. They weren't heroes either. They were, more than anything, casualties of their own world who happened to still be walking around for now. Let's talk about how someone in that position actually learned the trade. Because here's the second myth we need to quietly set on fire. There was no secret school, no mountain monastery, no wise old master handing down decades of accumulated wisdom about pressure points and poison recipes. If you picture candlelit training halls and years of disciplined instruction, you're thinking of fiction, not history. In the real medieval world, if you became reasonably good at this work, it's because you survived your early, terrible attempts at it. That's the whole curriculum. Trial, error, and an enormous amount of luck standing in for skill. If you happen to have military experience that gave you a real advantage, you already knew how to hold a blade properly, how to move without collapsing into exhaustion, how to keep your nerve when things went wrong. If you didn't have that background, you were mostly guessing. The stabbing part, brutally, tends to be more intuitive than people expect. The surviving afterward part is where most people failed. There were no manuals, no experienced elder walking you through where a target's private guards typically stood, or which servant's door led to which private chamber. You learned that sort of thing by making mistakes in real time, dangling from a window ledge at 2 a.m., wondering whether you'd wandered into the wrong wing of the house entirely, and trying very hard not to sneeze. Poison, in particular, was almost entirely trial and error, with a heavy weighting toward error. Sometimes a particular plant or root worked exactly as intended. More often, your target simply grew a little nauseated, blamed a bad piece of meat, and became noticeably more suspicious of every dish placed in front of him for weeks afterward. There was no way to test dosage safely. No apothecary handing out professional guidance to hired killers. You were working from rumor, folk knowledge, and a fair amount of superstition, with your own stomach as the only quality control system available, which, understandably, most people were reluctant to use. Occasionally, and this really was rare, someone might get informal guidance from an older thief or a retired mercenary. A tip about which cobblestones creak, a trick for tying a rope so it holds under sudden weight. But mentorship in this world was thin and short-lived, mostly because people in this line of work didn't retire in any comfortable sense. They simply stopped being seen. As for weapons, forget the ornate blades and hidden mechanical gadgets modern media loves. Real tools tended to be whatever could be acquired without drawing attention and hidden without jingling against something else. A dagger, ideally stolen rather than purchased, since purchases could be traced. Maybe a length of cord if strangulation seemed more practical for a particular situation. Nothing large, nothing impressive to look at, nothing that couldn't be tucked beneath a worn cloak. So no, this wasn't some elegant, disciplined martial art passed down through generations of masters. It was closer to grim, practical survival, refined slowly and painfully through repetition. You became competent if you became competent at all, by doing the job badly a few times and somehow living through the aftermath. There was no ceremony marking your progress, just bruises, a growing list of near misses, and a creeping, permanent awareness that you were entirely on your own. Now let's talk about money, because that's usually where this story actually begins for most people, with the promise of it, and the slow, sinking realization of what that promise was actually worth. When someone hired a killer in the medieval world, they weren't hiring an employee. They were purchasing a single, discreet, deniable service, and ideally, they wanted no lingering connection to it afterward, including, uncomfortably, to the person who'd actually done the work. The arrangement usually involved a pouch of coin up front, with the rest, if you were fortunate enough to be dealing with someone honest, promised, once the job was confirmed done. And that phrase did a lot of quiet, dangerous work. It meant, once we're sure you didn't leave a trail back to us, once we're sure you're not going to talk, once we're sure you're not still useful to keep alive. So you did the job. You slipped past guards you'd spent days studying. You did something that can't be undone. And then you went back for the rest of your payment, only to discover, more often than anyone would like to admit, that your employer had suddenly become very difficult to find. Or worse, had decided that a blade was a cheaper way to close the arrangement than a coin purse. Even in the cases where you were paid honestly, it rarely felt like enough once you weighed it against what the job had actually cost you. Not just the physical risk, but the days spent in hiding beforehand, sleeping in haystacks and stables, the fleas, the constant low hum of dread. You'd walk away with a modest handful of silver and a quiet, unspoken warning. You were never here. And then there were the arrangements that were never real to begin with. Political traps dressed up as contracts. You'd be told a target was dangerous and needed removing, only to discover on arrival that the target was bait, and the real danger was the small army of guards waiting patiently in the dark. Congratulations, you just walked into a setup with your description already being sketched for the gallows notice. And naturally, there was no legal recourse whatsoever if a client failed to pay. You couldn't file a complaint. You couldn't take anyone to court. The only official proceeding you were likely to be part of involved you standing in front of a judge as the accused, not the plaintiff. So the smart ones, the ones who managed to survive more than one job, learned quickly. Get as much as possible up front. Trust absolutely no promise made after the fact. And never, under any circumstances, believe the smooth-talking go-between who insists this particular job is the one that finally changes your fortunes. It usually did change something. Usually your life expectancy. Let's move now to the tools of this grim trade, because if you're picturing something sleek and purpose-built, it's time to let that go too. Forget retractable blades, forget vials of glowing poison, forget any of the polished gadgetry that fiction loves to hand its assassins. In reality, your equipment was whatever you could steal, scavenge, borrow, or sharpen yourself, and whatever you could hide under a worn cloak without it clinking, rattling, or catching the light. If you were lucky, genuinely, unusually lucky, you had a decent dagger. Not curved and ornamental, not engraved with anything meaningful, just functional. Sharp enough to do its job, hopefully free of rust, and ideally not still carrying the faint, unfortunate smell of whoever you'd last used it on. A good blade wasn't a status symbol in this world. It was closer to a lifeline, and you treated it that way. Poison, as we touched on, existed, but it was nowhere near as elegant or reliable as later stories made it sound. Most of it came from plants, minerals, or occasionally less pleasant sources, and its effects were wildly unpredictable. Some concoctions acted almost immediately. Others took hours or even days, giving the target plenty of time to recover, grow suspicious, and start asking uncomfortable questions about who'd been near his food. A length of rope had its uses too. You could climb with it, restrain someone with it, or, if circumstances called for it, use it more directly. But rope required real skill under pressure, and there wasn't much time to fumble with knots while your target was very much awake and very much fighting back. Bows were effective in the rare situations where you actually had one, knew how to use it well, and could somehow get it into a heavily guarded space without anyone noticing a grown adult casually strolling through a palace corridor carrying a longbow. Most jobs simply didn't allow for that kind of distance. This was close, personal, quiet work, not marksmanship, and there were no backups. If your one blade snapped, bent, or vanished down a well in a moment of panic, you improvised with whatever was at hand, a broken roof tile, a rusted nail, sheer desperate creativity. Tools were carried hidden in hems, tucked into boot linings, sometimes wrapped inside a loaf of bread if the situation called for it. You kept them close not out of professional pride, but because in this line of work, your tool was often the only thing standing between you and failure. Now, even with the right tools, actually reaching a target was its own enormous obstacle. Nobody was paying good coin to have some unimportant local farmer quietly removed. The people worth hearing an assassin for were, almost by definition, well protected. Nobles, bishops, military commanders, occasionally royalty, and these people were, understandably, extremely difficult to get near. Start with the guards. Not one bored man at a gate, but often dozens, layered in shifts, covering every entrance, every hallway, every possible route in. You'd spend days, sometimes weeks, simply watching, learning which door creaked, learning exactly how many steps it took before the guard with the persistent cough needed to catch his breath, learning the small, human rhythms of a household that most people never bother to notice. Then there was the architecture itself. Castles weren't built with casual visitors in mind. Gatehouses, narrow murder holes positioned directly above entryways, moats stocked with considerably more than decorative fish. If you didn't drown trying to cross, you still had arrow slits and, in the worst cases, boiling liquid waiting for anyone attempting an unauthorized climb. And then, layered on top of the architecture, there were the people who lived and worked inside it. Cooks, scribes, stable hands, chambermaids. A single unfamiliar face, one wrong answer to a simple question, and word would travel through the household faster than you could invent a convincing cover story. Assassins weren't only fighting swords and stone walls. They were fighting gossip, and in a close-knit medieval household, gossip moved with real speed whenever it involved keeping someone's head attached to their shoulders. Finally, there was the target themselves, and targets worth this kind of investment tended to be paranoid, often for very good reason. Surrounded by rivals, distant relatives with their own claims to a title, and any number of people offering warm smiles while quietly calculating what they'd gain from a sudden vacancy. Meals were tasted before they reached the table. Bedchambers were locked, sometimes multiple times over. Some particularly cautious nobles slept in different rooms on a rotating basis, turning their own home into an unpredictable maze even for those who lived there. Even a feast, which might seem like an obvious opportunity, everyone relaxed, wine flowing freely, came with its own layers of difficulty. Yes, the target might be less alert, but so would half the room be full of witnesses, several armed guards, and the ever-present risk of a single loud noise turning a quiet plan into a very public disaster. So getting close enough to actually complete the job could take weeks of patient, careful groundwork, posing convincingly as a servant, slowly earning the trust, or at least the disinterest, of household staff, finding a quiet hiding place and waiting, sometimes for days, for the single narrow window when everything aligned. And when that moment finally arrived, there was no room for hesitation, no room for a second attempt. One precise, silent, controlled action, or you became the next grim example nailed to the city gate as a warning to anyone who might get similar ideas. Which brings us naturally to disguise, because reaching a target usually meant not looking like yourself at all, and definitely not looking like the version of assassin that modern imagination has built. Forget sleek black fabric and dramatic hoods billowing in some conveniently timed wind. Real disguises in this period were far less glamorous: peasant rags, an oversized monk's robe that had clearly belonged to someone else more recently than you'd like to admit. Occasionally, the leftover uniform of a guard, complete with whatever unpleasant history it carried with it. The goal wasn't to look mysterious. The goal was to look like nobody worth a second glance, which, in a world where most people already looked worn down, malnourished, and quietly exhausted, was actually its own kind of challenge. You didn't stand out because of a dramatic cloak. You stood out because you fumbled a chamber pot you were supposed to know how to carry, or because you couldn't correctly name the household cat, or because you kept nervously adjusting your belt to hide a blade wrapped in cloth underneath it. Masks, as fiction often imagines them, weren't really a practical option. Covering your face too fully tended to make you look diseased rather than mysterious, which admittedly did keep conversations short, but also tended to get you turned away at the door entirely. If someone asked who you were, you needed an answer ready immediately. A name, a role, a plausible reason for being somewhere you clearly didn't belong. And even a good answer only bought you a little time. Household staff who worked in the same building every day noticed unfamiliar faces quickly, especially ones who hesitated a beat too long before answering simple questions. A poorly executed disguise didn't lead to dramatic unmasking scenes. It usually led to a very sudden, very undramatic blow to the head, with whatever heavy object happened to be nearby. The uncomfortable truth is that a disguise never really protected you. At best, it bought you a few confused, valuable minutes. After that, you needed to be finished, gone, or convincing enough to keep breathing normally while surrounded by people you were there to kill. And if the disguise ever slipped, if anyone realized who, or what, you actually were, there was no elegant escape plan waiting. Just the sudden, sinking, understanding that the quiet, careful weeks of preparation were about to end very loudly. Let's talk now about something that rarely gets mentioned when people romanticize this line of work: how completely, crushingly alone it made you. Because if you were a medieval assassin, you didn't have a team. There was no clever accomplice waiting around the corner with a getaway horse. No trusted contact feeding you secret information through coded messages. No warm, encouraging mentor checking in on you between jobs. You had yourself, whatever blade you'd managed to acquire, and a permanent, gnawing suspicion of absolutely everyone around you. There were no formal guilds you could rely on, not in any real sense. If you ever heard whispers of a secret brotherhood of killers meeting in candlelit chambers, that was almost certainly tavern gossip, exaggerated by ale and boredom rather than anything resembling organized reality. You were far more likely to encounter rumors of such a network than an actual living member of one. And the isolation wasn't accidental. It was survival strategy. Every person who knew what you did for a living was a potential weakness. Every conversation that went slightly too far, every drink shared a little too freely, every friendly face that started asking gentle questions about your past, all of it represented risk. Even your own clients often didn't know your real name, and if they did happen to learn it, you were already quietly planning how to disappear before that knowledge became dangerous. Friendships were, for the most part, simply not survivable in this line of work. Friends ask questions. Friends notice unexplained bruises, strange hours. And the fact that you insist on sleeping with a blade tucked beneath your pillow. Romantic relationships were even more dangerous. Someone who loves you tends to want to know you, and knowing you in this profession could get them killed alongside you the moment anyone came looking. Even other criminals kept a careful, wary distance. Thieves, smugglers, forgers, the general underworld of the medieval city was, in its own strange way, fairly social. People who steal often still gather, drink, trade information, occasionally even help each other. But killers for hire existed slightly outside even that loose community. You were the person other outlaws quietly avoided sitting next to, because your presence alone was a liability. Nobody wanted to be the one sharing a table with the man a mob might come looking for at any moment. And there was no space for sympathy either. You couldn't turn to anyone and admit how difficult it was to live with what you'd done. If you tried, you'd either be dismissed as lying or treated as genuinely dangerous. And honestly, neither reaction would have been entirely wrong. So the silence became permanent. You carried your memories, your scars, and your growing collection of secrets entirely alone. If you ever stopped at an inn for the night, you learned certain habits quickly, almost instinctively. You sat in the darkest corner available. You kept your back to the wall and your eyes on the door. You never drank enough to loosen your tongue. You never stayed more than a single night in the same place. And you certainly never gave your real name unless coin had already changed hands first, and even then, it probably wasn't the truth. Being an assassin, more than anything else, meant becoming extraordinarily skilled at disappearing. Not just from a crowded room, but slowly, permanently, from every version of a normal life you might once have imagined for yourself. Now let's talk about what happened when things went wrong, because in this profession, Wrong wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was frequently fatal and rarely quick. Imagine you've done everything correctly up to this point. Weeks of quiet observation, a convincing disguise, a careful route planned in and out. And then at the critical moment, something shifts. Maybe your target turns unexpectedly. Maybe they're accompanied by a child you hadn't accounted for. Maybe your hand simply trembles at exactly the wrong second, betrayed by nerves you'd spent weeks trying to steady. In an instant, the entire careful plan collapses, and suddenly you are no longer a shadow. You are a witnessed, described, actively hunted threat inside a building full of armed men who were specifically trained to deal with exactly this situation. Failure here wasn't a quiet professional setback. There was no opportunity to regroup, apologize, and try again next week. A failed attempt meant your target was very much alive, very much aware someone had just tried to kill them, and very motivated to make sure the entire household, guard force, and local watch knew your description immediately. The guards you'd spent so long studying and avoiding were now actively searching for you, and every advantage you'd built through patient observation evaporated the moment your cover broke. Worse, in many cases, it wasn't only the guards you needed to fear, it was your own employer. A failed assassin wasn't simply useless, they were now actively dangerous to keep alive. Someone who could be captured, questioned, and eventually made to talk. And in a world with no shortage of unpleasant methods for extracting confessions, talk was less a possibility than an eventual certainty. Which meant the very people who'd hired you were often the first ones motivated to make sure you never had the chance. There was no second attempt built into this line of work. No apologetic note promising better luck next time. You had one narrow window, and if that window closed on you, the best possible outcome was usually a quick death before anyone managed to extract the name of whoever had paid you in the first place. And even beyond the physical danger, failure carried its own quieter, more personal weight. You hadn't just failed to kill someone. You'd failed at the one skill this entire brutal, lonely lifestyle depended on, staying invisible. In this profession, competence and invisibility were essentially the same thing, and the moment you lost one, you lost both. No amount of previous successful jobs mattered once people had a face, a description, a reason to look for you specifically. You were, in that instant, only as valuable and as safe as your most recent outcome. But let's say for a moment that everything went right. The plan worked. The target fell silently, without alarm, without struggle. No screaming, no clashing steel, just a sudden stillness where a powerful person used to be. In fiction, this is often the triumphant moment, the hero standing over their fallen enemy, perhaps allowing themselves a brief, satisfied pause. In reality, there was no pause available to you whatsoever. The moment your task was complete, your new and immediate job became simply staying alive long enough to leave the building. There was no victory lap, no quiet celebratory drink with the person who'd hired you, no debrief, no acknowledgement, nothing resembling closure. The instant the deed was done, you were already running, likely still catching your breath, quite possibly with blood on your boots, aware that somewhere nearby, a hunting dog was already being handed something of yours to sniff. Your escape route needed to have been planned well before you ever raised a blade, which doors would still be unlocked, which alleys offered cover, whether a particular boatman, one who owed you a favor or simply preferred not to ask questions, would be waiting where you needed him to be, because within minutes the entire city could shift into lockdown, gates sealed, checkpoints manned. Guards handed a rough description and a single, urgent instruction: find whoever did this by any means necessary. And then there was the matter of your employer, assuming they were even planning to honor the arrangement at all. Meeting them openly, celebrating together, collecting a friendly thank you, none of that was realistic. If anything, the person who'd hired you now viewed you as the single greatest threat to their own safety. You knew their name. You knew what they'd asked of you. You'd proven, undeniably, that you were capable of getting close enough to kill someone heavily protected, which made you dangerous to everyone, including the very person who'd paid for that danger in the first place. So even a successful job rarely felt like victory. It felt like the starting gun for an entirely new, more desperate phase of survival. Weeks spent sleeping in barns and haylofts, bribing reluctant ferry operators, shaving off a beard in the dark by feel alone, adopting a new name, a new invented history, blending in with a group of traveling monks or merchants heading toward some distant, unfamiliar city. Success, in this profession, didn't mean the danger was over. It simply meant you got to begin the entire exhausting cycle of hiding and reinventing yourself all over again, this time with even more people actively looking for you than before. Now let's slow down and sit with something the average medieval person genuinely believed about figures like this, because the fear surrounding assassins wasn't purely rational. It was steeped in superstition, and that superstition made an already dangerous life even more precarious. To most ordinary villagers, someone capable of slipping past armed guards, vanishing into darkness, and leaving a powerful person dead without a trace wasn't simply a skilled criminal. That kind of ability seemed to defy natural explanation entirely. In a world without much scientific understanding of stealth, timing, or basic tactics, people reached instead for the supernatural. Surely, they reasoned, such a person must have otherworldly help. Some believed assassins could shift their shape to avoid detection. Others insisted they were somehow protected from harm unless doused in holy water. Village storytellers spun tales of killers who'd made pacts with forest spirits, capable of passing through solid walls like smoke. Imagine walking through a small medieval village and overhearing a mother quietly warn her child, "Don't look him in the eye, he might curse you just by glancing back." That wasn't an exaggeration. Fear like that was common, and it shaped how ordinary people treated anyone who seemed even slightly out of place. Even your tools became suspect under this lens. A simple dagger wasn't just a weapon. Surely it had been forged under some unholy ritual. Poison wasn't chemistry or herbal knowledge. It was witchcraft, presumably stirred together under a full moon with ingredients too dark to name aloud. You might assume this reputation would actually work in your favor, keeping curious people at a cautious distance. In some ways it did. But it also created a far more dangerous problem. Superstitious crowds don't pause to verify facts before reacting. They don't ask questions before throwing stones or reaching for torches. The moment someone in a village died unexpectedly, an illness, an accident, even something as mundane as choking during a meal, whispers would begin almost immediately. Maybe it wasn't natural. Maybe a shadow man had passed through recently. Maybe it was him, whoever him happened to be that week. Simply being a stranger in the wrong village at the wrong time, especially following any unexplained death, was sometimes enough to draw suspicion and violence, regardless of whether you'd had anything to do with it. Which meant that constant movement wasn't optional. Staying too long in any one place risked exactly this kind of unpredictable mob reaction. A local priest ringing an alarm bell, a handful of frightened farmers suddenly arming themselves with pitchforks, absolutely convinced they'd finally caught the monster responsible for whatever recent misfortune had struck their community. And if you happened to be carrying anything even slightly unusual, dried herbs, foreign coins, an accent that didn't match the region, that alone could be enough to spark accusations of sorcery, followed swiftly by exactly the kind of violent, unquestioning response you'd spent your entire existence trying to avoid. In a world that genuinely believed monsters could wear ordinary human faces, being too quiet, too capable, or simply too difficult to explain made you a target in your own right. Separate entirely from whatever job you'd actually been hired to do. Now let's return briefly to poison, because it deserves a slightly closer, more honest look. In popular imagination, poison represents the elegant option, a quiet, bloodless death delivered with minimal risk. In medieval reality, it was closer to a desperate gamble dressed up as sophistication. You didn't have access to anything resembling a precisely measured, reliably fatal substance. Instead, you were working with plants, minerals, occasionally more unpleasant natural sources, all gathered, ground, and prepared using nothing more than folk knowledge and guesswork. There was no scientific measurement involved. You estimated. A slightly small dose might simply upset someone's stomach for a day, prompting nothing worse than a canceled dinner and a newly cautious cook. A slightly large dose risked exposing you to the same substance during preparation, potentially harming you before you ever got near your intended target. And actually delivering the poison presented its own layered challenge. You couldn't simply walk into a noble household's kitchen and season a passing dish. You'd need to bribe or convincingly impersonate kitchen staff, find a narrow, unsupervised moment, and somehow bypass whatever precautions a cautious household had already put in place, which, for anyone genuinely worth targeting, tended to be extensive. Meals for the wealthy and powerful were frequently tasted before serving, sometimes by designated staff, sometimes even by trusted animals kept specifically for that unfortunate purpose. By the time food actually reached an important person's plate, it had often passed through more layers of security than most modern events manage today. Even assuming you successfully slipped the poison past every safeguard, the results remained frustratingly unpredictable. Some substances acted within minutes, others took hours, or occasionally days, giving your target ample time to grow suspicious, summon physicians, and potentially recover entirely, now noticeably more alert to anyone unfamiliar lingering near the kitchen. And if suspicion did eventually settle somewhere, it rarely landed on the trusted cook or the official taster. It landed on the unfamiliar figure with quiet manners and an unusual knowledge of herbs, which, uncomfortably often, meant landing directly on you. So poison, rather than being the clean, efficient tool of legend, was in practice slow, unreliable, and dangerous in ways that had very little to do with the poison itself. If you were ever caught attempting it, there was rarely a quick end waiting for you. Confessions in this era weren't gently requested. They were extracted, methodically and painfully, often expanding well beyond whatever single act you'd actually attempted, until you found yourself confessing to poisoning half the household purely to make the process stop. Finally, let's talk about legacy, because if you're picturing history remembering these figures by name, admired or infamous, that's yet another expectation worth setting aside. Even if you successfully altered the course of a small region's politics, removed a genuinely dangerous tyrant, or quietly ended a looming succession crisis before it could spiral into war, your name was never meant to survive the event. At absolute best, you became a rumor, a hooded figure, a quiet stranger who never quite finished his drink before disappearing into the night. You might have carried out one of the most consequential acts of the decade, and still ended up recorded, if recorded at all, as nothing more than an unexplained death in someone's private correspondence. This wasn't an accident or an oversight. It was, in fact, precisely the point. Your employer never wanted a story attached to what happened. They wanted plausible deniability, distance, and silence. The fewer people who knew who had actually carried out the act, the safer everyone involved remained, including, somewhat ironically, you. So your name, if you'd even given a real one to begin with, was quietly buried the moment the job concluded. There were no signatures left behind. No trophies kept as proof of your work. No lingering trace connecting you to what had happened, because in this profession, any trace at all represented a serious, ongoing risk. There was no monument waiting for you either. No grateful commission from a relieved noble family, no carved stone bearing your likeness. If a powerful person wanted a statue built, they commissioned one celebrating themselves, not the quiet figure who'd made their continued survival or their sudden rise to power possible. At best, you received a simple, unmarked grave. At worst, considerably worse, your head displayed somewhere prominent, labeled simply as a warning to others who might consider similar work. Occasionally, your name did survive, but only as a cautionary tale rather than genuine recognition. A whispered warning passed between nobles for generations. Remember what happened to that particular lord? Yes. And the one responsible was never found. That vague, unresolved mystery became your entire legacy. Not fame, not historical acknowledgement, simply a lingering, unsettling absence where a full story should have been. Because ultimately, that's what this profession demanded above everything else. You weren't meant to leave a mark on history. You were meant to vanish so completely that history itself struggled to prove you'd ever been there at all. Let's return one more time to the question of trust, because even after a job was finished, even after payment had technically changed hands, the danger from your own employer rarely disappeared. If anything, it often intensified. Understand the position your client found themselves in once the work was done. They'd hired someone to do something irreversible, something that could end their own reputation, their own freedom, possibly their own life if it were ever traced back to them. And now, walking around somewhere in their city was a person who knew exactly what had happened, exactly who had ordered it, and exactly how it had been carried out. To a nervous employer, that knowledge made you far more dangerous walking free than the original target had ever been standing in your way. So what happened next varied, but rarely in your favor. Sometimes a client simply vanished from view entirely, refusing all further contact, denying any arrangement had ever existed in the first place. Sometimes, more chillingly, they quietly arranged for a second hire, someone new, brought in specifically to eliminate the first assassin and permanently close the loop. There are documented patterns suggesting this kind of double arrangement wasn't even particularly unusual. Hire one person to complete the job, hire a second to make sure the first person never lived to discuss it. No refunds necessary, just a reduced, tidier level of long-term risk for the client. And if you ever considered pushing back, threatening exposure, demanding better payment through intimidation, that almost always proved to be the final, fatal miscalculation of your career. Powerful people in this era didn't respond to threats from hired killers with negotiation. They responded with overwhelming, decisive force, precisely because allowing themselves to appear vulnerable to blackmail was, in their world, a far greater danger than simply eliminating the problem entirely. Even in the rarer situations where a client actually possessed some genuine sense of honor and paid fully, without incident, you couldn't relax completely. You still had to assume, quietly and permanently, that you were being watched from a comfortable distance. That someone somewhere remembered your face, your walk, your particular habits, and was simply waiting to see whether you'd become inconvenient again someday. Even a completed, honestly paid job rarely bought you real safety. It bought you, at best, a temporary pause before the next layer of danger revealed itself. This leads naturally into perhaps the cruelest truth of this entire profession. There was no retirement waiting at the end of it, no matter how skilled or careful you became. Suppose somehow, against overwhelming odds, you survived. You outlived multiple employers, evaded capture through multiple close calls, and managed to accumulate enough coin and caution to consider stepping away from the work entirely. In the modern imagination, this is often where the story ends warmly. A quiet cottage somewhere peaceful, a new identity, a slow, comfortable fade into old age. The real medieval version offered nothing resembling that comfort. The fundamental problem was simple and inescapable. You carried too much dangerous knowledge in your head to ever be considered fully safe by anyone who'd been involved in your past work. Names, details, secrets that powerful families desperately wanted buried permanently. People in your position weren't allowed to simply retire in peace. They needed, from the perspective of those who'd once hired them, to be either completely forgotten or completely gone. And unfortunately, those two outcomes tended to look remarkably similar in practice. So even stepping away from the work didn't mean stepping away from the fear. You changed your name once, then likely again. You moved somewhere unfamiliar, where nobody had reason to ask pointed questions about your past. You invented a plausible former occupation, perhaps claiming you'd once worked as a guard, or a merchant's assistant, or a herbalist, something ordinary enough to avoid scrutiny. And even then, sleep rarely came easily. Every unexpected knock at the door triggered old instincts. Every unfamiliar face passing through your new, quiet village carried the faint possibility of recognition. Years of this kind of constant vigilance changed people in lasting ways. Simple pleasures became complicated. You avoided crowds instinctively. You sat facing doorways out of pure habit rather than active choice. Deep, comfortable relationships became difficult, sometimes impossible, because genuine closeness required a level of openness that your entire survival strategy had spent years training you to avoid. There was no clean endpoint to this life. Just a slow, quiet fade into obscurity, always watching, always slightly braced until eventually, hopefully peacefully, though rarely with any certainty, the watching simply stopped. So let's step back now, at the end of this long, grim journey through a life most people never think carefully about, and consider what we've actually learned tonight. Being a medieval assassin was never the darkly glamorous, quietly admirable existence that later stories have made it out to be. It wasn't noble. It wasn't secretly heroic beneath a layer of moral complexity. It was, more than anything else, a short, exhausting, profoundly lonely path taken almost exclusively by people who'd already lost everything softer that life had once offered them. If you'd somehow found yourself living this life, chances are you wouldn't have lasted particularly long. You'd have made a mistake born from inexperience rather than carelessness. You'd have trusted the wrong stranger for information, or hesitated at precisely the wrong moment, or been recognized by someone whose face you'd forgotten but who hadn't forgotten yours. And once discovered, there was no clever escape waiting. Just unfamiliar terrain, exhausted legs, and a world that had never been designed with your survival in mind. And even in the rare scenario where everything somehow went right, again and again, across an entire unlikely career, the reward waiting at the end was never comfort, recognition, or peace. It was simply more running, more disappearing, more quiet, permanent distance from any life resembling connection or rest. This wasn't a profession built on power or control. It was a profession built entirely on erasure, erasing your name, your history, your presence, until eventually, the only thing left behind was silence. A silence so complete that most of these lives passed entirely unrecorded, remembered by no one, questioned by no one, exactly as the dangerous, desperate world that created them had always intended. Let's slow down again and spend some real time on a part of this story we've only touched on so far, the actual, real historical cases. Because behind all this discussion of tools, disguises, and lonely survival, there were flesh and blood people, real events, real names recorded in chronicles, court records, and the nervous letters of frightened nobles. Tonight, let's wander through a few of them slowly, the way you'd wander through an old, half-forgotten hallway. One of the most famous names connected to the idea of the medieval assassin isn't even, strictly speaking, European. It's a word that eventually made its way into English itself: assassin. The term is widely believed to trace back to a group active in the mountains of Persia and Syria during the 11th and 12th centuries, a religious and political sect known to history as the Nizari Ismailis, though popularly remembered simply as the Hashashin. Their base of operations, a mountain fortress called Alamut, perched high in the Persian mountains, became almost mythical in later European retellings. Now, here's where we need to be careful, the way any good, slow bedtime history should be. A great deal of what circulated about this group in medieval Europe was wildly exaggerated, filtered through fear, rumor, and more than a little anti-Islamic prejudice from Crusader-era chroniclers who never actually visited Alamut themselves. Stories spread of young men drugged into blind loyalty, promised gardens of paradise, willing to die on command for their leader. Most modern historians treat these particular tales with real skepticism. They read less like sober historical record and more like propaganda designed to make a genuinely effective political organization seem supernatural and monstrous rather than simply well organized. What does seem to be true, stripped of the more fantastical layers, is that this group did use targeted, high-profile killings as a deliberate political strategy, largely because they were a smaller, less militarily powerful sect surrounded by larger, hostile powers. Assassination, in their case, wasn't chaotic or personal. It was a calculated substitute for open warfare they couldn't otherwise win. Their targets tended to be prominent religious and political leaders, often killed in extremely public settings, a mosque, a court, a crowded gathering, which was itself a deliberate psychological tactic. A quiet death in a private bedchamber sends one kind of message. A sudden, unstoppable killing in the middle of a heavily guarded public event sends an entirely different, far more unsettling one. Nowhere is safe, and no amount of protection will save you. This is genuinely important context for tonight's larger story, because it illustrates something we've been circling throughout this entire narration. Assassination in the medieval world wasn't only the desperate, disorganized last resort of impoverished individuals we described earlier. In certain contexts, particularly where a political or religious group lacked the numbers for conventional warfare, it became a deliberate, almost formalized strategic tool. The individuals who carried out these specific killings were often true believers rather than simply desperate mercenaries, which sets them apart somewhat from the lonelier, more transactional figures we've spent most of tonight discussing. But the core risks remained eerily similar. Nearly all of them died during or immediately after their attacks. Survival, let alone any kind of quiet retirement, was never realistically part of the plan. Let's travel now to a very different setting, the political hothouse of late medieval and early Renaissance Italy, where the city-states, Florence, Milan, Venice, Naples, existed in a near-constant, simmering state of rivalry, alliance, and betrayal. Political assassination here operated somewhat differently than in the isolated, rural version of the profession we described earlier. In a densely packed, sophisticated urban environment, killings were often woven directly into the fabric of formal political maneuvering, sometimes even discussed, in careful, coded language, within diplomatic correspondence. Take, for example, the infamous Pazzi conspiracy of 1478 in Florence, a plot aimed at eliminating Lorenzo de' Medici and his brother Giuliano, the two most powerful men in the city, during Easter Sunday Mass inside the Florence Cathedral itself. The choice of setting wasn't accidental. A crowded, sacred space offered a moment when the targets would be relatively still, surrounded by witnesses too shocked and reverent to react quickly, and crucially, without the full protection of their usual armed guards, who couldn't easily carry weapons inside a place of worship. The plan very nearly succeeded. Giuliano de' Medici was stabbed to death at the altar, struck down by conspirators who'd spent considerable time planning the exact, precise moment of the signal. Lorenzo, though wounded, managed to escape into the sacristy and survive. What followed offers a vivid, brutal illustration of everything we discussed earlier about the fate awaiting failed conspirators. Florence descended into immediate, furious chaos. Conspirators were hunted through the streets within hours. Several were hanged from the windows of government buildings, their bodies left on public display for days as a deliberate, grim warning. One conspirator, having fled the city entirely, was eventually tracked down as far away as Constantinople, extradited back to Florence specifically, so he could be executed in front of the public whose ruler he'd tried to help kill. Notice how closely this real historical outcome mirrors everything we walked through earlier about failure. No mercy. No quiet, dignified consequence. Public, theatrical punishment specifically designed to discourage anyone else who might consider similar action. The Medici family understood, as most powerful medieval and Renaissance rulers understood, that surviving an assassination attempt wasn't enough on its own. The response had to be visible, brutal, and unmistakably clear. Let's move to England now, and a case that blends political assassination with something closer to outright civil war: the murder of Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, in 1170. This case is particularly fascinating for our purposes tonight because it illustrates just how blurry the line could become between a formal, sanctioned assassination and something closer to an impulsive act of loyalty gone catastrophically far. Becket had been King Henry II's close friend and ally before rising to become Archbishop of Canterbury, at which point their relationship soured dramatically over questions of church authority versus royal power. According to the traditional account, Henry, in a fit of frustration, uttered some version of the now famous phrase, often rendered as, "Will no one rid me of this troublesome priest?" during a moment of anger. Whether he meant this as a literal command or simply an exasperated outburst remains genuinely debated by historians. But 4 knights in his court took it as instruction enough. They traveled to Canterbury Cathedral, confronted Becket directly, and when he refused to submit to their demands, killed him inside the cathedral itself, in front of witnesses, in a scene so violent and sacrilegious that it shocked all of Christian Europe. Unlike the quiet, deniable killings we described earlier, this assassination happened almost entirely in the open, with no attempt at disguise or escape. The knights weren't hired killers in the desperate, impoverished sense we discussed earlier. They were loyal servants of the crown who believed, rightly or wrongly, that they were acting on their king's wishes. The aftermath demonstrates yet again how consequences in this era rarely stayed contained to the individuals directly involved. Henry II, though he almost certainly hadn't intended a literal assassination, faced enormous political and religious backlash. He was eventually forced into public penance, walking barefoot through the streets of Canterbury and allowing himself to be ritually whipped by monks as atonement. Becket himself, meanwhile, was canonized as a saint within just a few years, his tomb becoming one of the most significant pilgrimage sites in all of medieval Europe. A single violent afternoon in a cathedral reshaped religious and political history for generations. These 3 examples, the Hashashin operating from Alamut, the Pazzi conspirators in Florence, and Becket's killers in Canterbury, show us something important about the range hidden within this broader topic. Assassination in the medieval world wasn't a single, uniform phenomenon. It stretched from lonely, desperate, impoverished individuals hired quietly through back channels, all the way up to organized religious sects and formal political conspiracies involving some of the most powerful families in Europe. What connected nearly all of these cases, though, regardless of scale or motivation, was the aftermath: public punishment, brutal consequences, and in most cases, very little lasting personal glory for whoever actually delivered the fatal blow. Let's slow down even further tonight and drift into one of the strangest, quietest corners of this whole subject: the world of professional poisoners, particularly as it developed in Renaissance Italy, where poisoning eventually became something disturbingly close to a formal, respected trade. Venice offers one of the most fascinating examples here. The Venetian Republic maintained a powerful, secretive governing body known as the Council of Ten, responsible for state security, intelligence, and when deemed necessary, the quiet removal of political threats. Historical records, including surviving council minutes, suggest that Venice occasionally employed professional poisoners on something resembling an official basis, tasking them with eliminating foreign rivals, traitorous officials, or anyone considered a serious threat to the Republic's stability. Unlike the desperate freelance figures we spent most of tonight discussing, these individuals often operated with a strange kind of institutional backing. They weren't hired secretly through whispered tavern conversations. In some documented cases, they received payment directly from state funds, with target names discussed, however carefully coded, within official council proceedings. This represents a genuinely different category of assassin from most of what we've covered tonight. Someone employed by an actual government, with at least some institutional protection, rather than an isolated individual entirely on their own. Even so, the work itself remained every bit as unreliable and dangerous as the amateur poisoning attempts we described earlier. Renaissance era toxicology, despite Italy's reputation for sophistication in this particular dark art, remained fundamentally limited by the same basic problem plaguing poison throughout the medieval period. There was no precise science of dosage. Substances derived from arsenic compounds, certain plant extracts, and other naturally occurring toxins produced wildly inconsistent results depending on preparation, concentration, and simple individual variation in how different bodies responded. This brings us naturally to perhaps the most famous poisoning family in popular imagination, the Borgias. Now, we need to handle this one carefully, the way any careful historian would, because the Borgia family's reputation for poisoning enemies has been dramatically inflated by centuries of hostile propaganda, sensationalized retellings, and more recently, popular television dramatizations that prioritize entertainment over strict historical accuracy. What we can say with reasonable historical confidence is this: Rodrigo Borgia, who became Pope Alexander VI, and his children, particularly Cesare and Lucrezia Borgia, were widely rumored throughout their own lifetimes to use poison as a political tool against rivals, particularly wealthy cardinals whose estates would revert to the papacy upon their deaths. Whether these rumors reflected genuine, verified events, or simply reflected the family's numerous political enemies eagerly spreading damaging gossip, remains a matter of ongoing historical debate. Contemporary chroniclers, many of whom had their own reasons to dislike the Borgias, certainly repeated and amplified these stories enthusiastically. What's less debated is the broader cultural environment these rumors emerged from. Poison genuinely was a recognized, if unreliable, political tool throughout Renaissance Italy, used by numerous families, not exclusively the Borgias. The persistent association between the Borgia name and poisoning likely tells us as much about their political rivals' propaganda efforts as it does about their actual documented actions. This is worth remembering broadly whenever we discuss historical assassins and poisoners. Surviving records were rarely neutral. They were written by people with their own agendas, their own rivalries, their own reasons to shape a particular narrative for future generations. Let's shift now to a genuinely well-documented, less mythologized case: the slow, methodical use of poison within certain medieval and early modern royal courts, where suspicious deaths among rivals for succession occurred with troubling regularity, even if definitive proof rarely survived. Royal courts throughout medieval Europe existed in a near-constant state of quiet, simmering danger for exactly this reason. Any death that conveniently cleared a path to a throne, particularly a sudden, unexplained illness striking someone previously healthy, tended to generate immediate, quiet suspicion among courtiers, even when no formal accusation was ever made. Royal food tasters existed precisely because of this pervasive fear, a practical, institutionalized response to a threat that everyone acknowledged existed, even if it couldn't always be proven in any specific case. This created a genuinely strange psychological environment for anyone living within these courts. Imagine spending your entire life surrounded by people who might, at any given moment, be quietly planning your death through something as mundane as a shared meal. Wealthy, powerful individuals in this period developed elaborate precautions, testers, trusted personal cooks, sometimes even specially bred dogs kept specifically to sample food before their owners would touch it. Despite all these precautions, poisoning rumors persisted constantly, attached to nearly every unexpected royal death across the medieval period, regardless of whether any concrete evidence ever actually emerged. This pervasive fear tells us something important about our broader topic tonight. The medieval assassin didn't need to succeed particularly often to have a genuine, lasting cultural impact. Even relatively rare, poorly documented poisoning cases were enough to embed a permanent undercurrent of paranoia throughout the highest levels of medieval and Renaissance society. Every unexplained death among the wealthy carried at least a whisper of suspicion, a quiet question mark that historians, centuries later, often still can't fully resolve. Let's also spend a moment on a genuinely underappreciated aspect of this whole subject: female poisoners. A category frequently overlooked in popular retellings that tend to focus almost exclusively on male assassins wielding blades. Poison, unlike a dagger, didn't require significant physical strength or specialized combat training, which meant it was, historically, one of the few violent political tools genuinely accessible to women in a deeply patriarchal medieval society, particularly women working within domestic spaces like kitchens and households, where they had regular, unsupervised access to food preparation. Court records and chronicles throughout medieval and early modern Europe periodically mention women, often household servants or occasionally even wives, accused of poisoning husbands, employers, or rivals. Some of these cases appear to have been genuine. Others were almost certainly false accusations, convenient explanations offered whenever a powerful man died unexpectedly, and someone needed a plausible, easily blamed culprit. Women accused of poisoning during this period faced particularly brutal legal and social consequences, often treated with even less mercy than male assassins caught in more direct, violent acts, partly because poison was culturally associated with deception and domestic betrayal in ways that stabbings and open combat were not. So as we sit with all of this tonight, notice how much broader and stranger this whole subject becomes once we move beyond the single, familiar image of a hooded figure with a dagger. Assassination in the medieval and Renaissance world took many different forms: desperate individual mercenaries, organized religious sects, formal state-sponsored poisoners, household servants driven to extreme action, and everything scattered in between. What connected nearly all of them, across every single variation we've discussed tonight, was the same fundamental truth we opened with. This was never a glamorous life. It was a dangerous, uncertain, frequently short existence, regardless of which particular version of it you happen to occupy. Let's spend this final stretch of tonight's journey on something we've circled around all evening, but never looked at directly: what actually happened, legally and religiously, to an assassin who was caught. And then, at the very end, let's step back together and let this whole long story settle before we close our eyes. Across medieval Europe, capture rarely meant a swift, simple execution. It meant, first, an extended and often brutal process of interrogation, because authorities weren't merely interested in punishing the person in front of them. They wanted names. They wanted to know who had paid for the killing, who else might be involved, whether this was an isolated act or the visible edge of a larger conspiracy. Torture, uncomfortable as it is to sit with, was a routine and legally sanctioned part of this process in most medieval jurisdictions. Methods varied by region and era: the rack, thumbscrews, various forms of controlled suffocation or burning, but the underlying purpose was consistent everywhere. Extract a confession, extract accomplices, extract the full shape of the conspiracy before the body in custody stopped being useful. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it changes the picture of what getting caught actually meant for someone in this profession. It wasn't simply the end of a job gone wrong. It was often the beginning of a long, deliberately drawn-out process designed to squeeze every possible piece of information out of a person before they were finally allowed to die. Which is part of why, as we discussed earlier, so many assassins preferred death in the moment of capture over survival long enough to be formally questioned. A quick death resisting arrest was, in a very real sense, the more merciful outcome available. Once the interrogation concluded, the execution itself tended to be public, elaborate, and deliberately theatrical, because the goal was never simply to remove a threat. It was to project a message to everyone else who might be tempted towards similar action. Hanging was common throughout most of medieval Europe, often performed in a town's central square, or at a prominent crossroads where the body would remain visible for days afterward as a warning. In cases considered particularly severe, an attempt on a monarch's life, for example, or a killing that touched the royal succession directly, the punishment often escalated considerably. Drawing and quartering, practiced in England for the most serious offenses against the crown, involved a sequence of deliberately prolonged suffering followed by the public display of the body's remains at various locations, sometimes across an entire kingdom, as a distributed, geographically spread warning. Religious authorities added their own separate layer of consequence on top of secular punishment. In much of medieval Christian Europe, murder, and assassination specifically, was treated not merely as a crime against the state, but as a profound sin against God, carrying consequences that extended, in the period's genuine religious understanding, well beyond physical death. Excommunication was a real and greatly feared possibility for a captured assassin, particularly if the killing had occurred within or near a church, as in the Becket case we discussed earlier. Being formally cut off from the church meant, in the sincere belief system of the period, being cut off from any hope of salvation, a consequence many medieval people feared considerably more than physical death itself. This religious dimension shaped how ordinary communities viewed and treated known or suspected assassins as well. Burial practices offer a particularly telling detail here. Convicted murderers, especially those whose crimes carried this added religious weight, were frequently denied burial in consecrated church ground, instead relegated to unmarked plots outside cemetery walls, sometimes at crossroads, a location itself steeped in folk superstition about restless, wandering spirits unable to find peace. For a deeply religious medieval population, this wasn't a minor administrative detail. It represented a permanent, cosmic exile, denying the person any hope of the peaceful afterlife their community believed awaited properly buried Christians. Now, it's worth pausing to acknowledge that attitudes toward assassination weren't uniform across every culture and region we've touched on tonight. In the Islamic world, for instance, jurisprudence around targeted killing carried its own distinct religious and legal framework, differing meaningfully from Christian European approaches, and varying considerably again between different scholars, sects, and historical periods. The Hashashin, whom we discussed earlier, operated within their own particular religious and political justification, one that framed their actions as legitimate resistance against what they perceived as illegitimate or unjust rule, a framing their many enemies obviously rejected entirely. Similarly, in various medieval Asian contexts, from Japan's later, more codified traditions around covert operatives to earlier Chinese historical accounts of political assassination during periods of dynastic upheaval, cultural attitudes toward this kind of violence carried their own distinct moral and legal frameworks, shaped by very different religious and philosophical traditions than those dominating medieval Christian Europe. Tonight's script has focused primarily on the European experience simply because that's where our core narrative and source material has centered. But it's worth remembering, as you drift toward sleep, that this entire dark, secretive profession existed in some form across nearly every complex medieval society on Earth, each shaped by its own particular laws, religious beliefs, and cultural anxieties. What remained remarkably consistent across nearly all of these different cultural contexts, though, was the fundamental social position of the assassin. Regardless of region, regardless of religious framework, regardless of whether the killing was framed as desperate crime or sanctioned political necessity, The individual who actually carried out the act rarely received lasting honor or security in return. They were used and then, in nearly every documented tradition we've discussed tonight, quietly discarded, forgotten, or eliminated once their usefulness expired. So let's bring this long night's journey to its close now, gently, the way we always do. We began this evening by clearing away the glamorous fiction, the sleek black robes, the hidden blades, the secret training temples, and replaced it with something far quieter and far sadder. A picture of ordinary, desperate people, pushed by circumstance into an extraordinarily dangerous, lonely trade. We walked through how they trained, mostly through survival rather than instruction. How they were paid, often unreliably, sometimes not at all. How they moved through disguises that offered only minutes of protection rather than true safety. How isolated they remained, cut off from friendship, love, even casual companionship, because closeness itself represented mortal risk. We watched what happened when things went wrong, and equally, we watched that even success rarely brought peace, only a new, more urgent phase of running and hiding. We wandered briefly into genuine historical territory, the mountain fortress at Alamut, the blood-soaked cathedral floor in Florence, the sacred, violated space of Canterbury Cathedral, and saw how these same patterns played out in the real historical record, not just in our earlier, more general description of the trade. We sat with the strange, poisoned world of Renaissance Italian courts, the quiet, overlooked role of women within this dark profession, and finally, tonight, the brutal legal and religious machinery waiting for anyone unfortunate enough to be caught. And through all of it, one truth remained constant, echoing quietly under every single story we told tonight. This was never a life of power, control, or lasting legacy. It was a life defined almost entirely by erasure. Erasure of comfort, erasure of relationships, erasure of safety, and in nearly every single case history has left us, eventual erasure of the person's own name and memory. Perhaps that's a strange note to drift off to sleep on, but there's something quietly calming in it too, if you sit with it a little longer. Most of us, thankfully, will never face even a fraction of the fear, isolation, and danger that define these lives. Whatever quiet, ordinary difficulties tomorrow might hold for you, they exist within a life that has a name, a history, people who know you, and a place in the world that won't simply be erased the moment you're no longer useful to someone else. Rest well tonight. Let the weight of this old, dark, forgotten world settle somewhere far behind you, and let your own quieter, safer life carry you gently into sleep. Thank you for spending these long, slow hours with us tonight. We'll see you in the next one.